In this video, I will talk about extraneous and confounding variables, understanding what they mean and which implications they may have if unaccounted for your experiment has implications for you navigating the research space safely, and also demonstrating the effects that you are investigating on the dependent variable with more confidence. Just a bit of a refresher, an experiment is a method of an investigation in which we vary the levels of our independent variable. In other words, we are manipulating it, and we are looking at changes that those variations cause in our dependent variable. This is how I like to visualize my dependent variable. Dependent variable can be anything that you are studying. It could be knowledge, it could be attitudes, it could be behavior, it could be policy or health outcomes. When it comes to research, it's important to have clear theory or hypothesis about the effects of these variations in independent variable on the dependent variable that you are researching. And ideally, it would be great to have a random allocation of participants into your conditions so that you control for researchers' bias. Now, an important aspect in this definition is actually this last part, which reads as controlling for any extraneous variables. Extraneous variable represents any variable or factor that you are not investigating, but it can affect the outcomes that you're observing in your dependent variable. And these extraneous variables can have different nature. They can be external nature environment or the impact of other people, or they can also be the factors that are intrinsically individual, in other words, pertain to your participants in the experiment. And if it's left uncontrolled, those extraneous variables can lead to inaccurate conclusions. You may find the relationship which are not statistically significant, or you may find relationships that are statistically significant, but they may not be accurate because there was something else that impacted on the relationship between your intervention and the outcomes that you were measuring. As a subtype of extraneous variables, there is such concept as confounding variables. And the confounding variables, they are very tricky because this is a type of a variable that affects both the independent variable and the dependent variable. So it messes around with both of them. And that's why the relationship that you are trying to establish and to measure between independent and dependent variable may be affected by the confounding variables. Now, these may all sound quite confusing. Let's have a look at an example to contextualize it. Let's say we are researching if memory capacity is related to test performance in first-year students. Let's say we have developed several interventions. And our first intervention, which is group 2, basically consists of 2 weeks training, where we run a memory capacity training in the first and in the 4th week. And then in the 5th week, we administer our memory capacity test. In the second group, we basically have 2 interventions. We run memory capacity training 4 weeks, every week over 4 weeks' time. And the control group does not receive any training whatsoever. And our hypothesis is that our 4 weeks training, which is group 2, should be more effective in increasing memory capacity measured through a test in week 5 compared to a 2-week training, compared to no training whatsoever. So here are the examples of a few extraneous variables which may impact on the dependent variable. And now I'm looking just extraneous variables overall linked to the dependent variable. I'm not looking at the confounding variables yet. And here I can say that regardless of my training, if on the day of the test in week 5, someone has experienced high stress, then none of those training, and especially my training that I think will be the most effective, will help students to perform on this memory capacity test. So we expect that under high stress conditions, there will be worse results. If our participants are also sleep deprived on the day of the test in group 2, they may also perform worse compared to control group or group 1. So I hope this gives you a really good example of what an extraneous variable can be because it significantly affects the relationship that you are studying. Now that we have had a look at extraneous variables overall, which is a high-level classification, let's have a look at its subtype, which is a confounding variable. Confounding variable affects both the independent and dependent variables. What could be a confounding variable here? The first example that I have here is actually the coffee consumption before each intervention in group 1. Let's say this group is a bit disadvantaged, right? Because they received training only 2 times. And this group is more advantaged because they receive training every week. But what if the coffee consumption and the high coffee consumption in particular can increase the alertness of the participant, and that will impact on the quality of that training? So they receive a bit of a super boost. In this case, it is a confounding variable because it impacts on the effect of your intervention on the outcome. Because in this case, if there was high coffee intake, which you didn't measure, which you didn't account for, these people will perform as good as people who received training every week for 4 weeks in group 2. Coffee intake can also be a confounding variable for the dependent variable. Because what if on the test day, they also had an increased coffee intake, and that additionally boosted their test performance on the test that we've administered? So in this case, you can see how coffee consumption can impact on how independent variable the intervention affects individuals who are subjected to this training, and also the outcome on the test day. Another example of a confounding variable could be ginkgo biloba intake in the control group. Control group does not receive any intervention, so that makes us assume that no memory capacity training should result in worst result on the test day. But what if these individuals take food supplements and they are engaged in some other activities which train their memory in the meantime, which you're not accounting for, and they don't perform worse on the test day? They may even perform better than group 2, which is expected to be the best intervention. And ginkgo biloba intake on the test day may also boost the performance. Now you may be wondering, how can one minimize the effects of confounding variables and extraneous variables? There are several strategies that are available for us as researchers. The first strategy is called restriction, and it applies only to the treatment groups. That's why I don't have a control group here, because control group is a non-treatment group. It does not receive any intervention. And restriction strategy suggests that you include individuals only with the same values of the potential confounding variables into your treatment groups. I've given you examples of potential confounding variables. So here you may say, I will include people with the same stress level. So then you have to decide, is it going to be high? Is it going to be low stress? Or you may say, yes, on top of stress level, then I also need to include people with the same ginkgo biloba intake, or none. The next confounding variable was coffee intake. So here you need to decide, well, what should be the coffee intake for the people that are allowed to take part in research? 1 coffee cup, 2 coffee cups, 3 coffee cups, and so on and so forth. So do you allow people with the same IQ to take part in your research if you're testing memory capacity? So as you can see with the restriction, it's getting a bit complicated. And that means that overall as a strategy, if you have too many restricting criteria, it actually restricts your sample. You'll have to churn through a lot of people to get those that meet this criteria, and you'll have to say goodbye to the other ones that do not qualify to take part in your research. That means that your experiment may take longer to complete as you will keep sampling, you'll keep going because you'll have to churn through lots of numbers. Another question is, can you potentially foresee all possible confounding and extraneous variables in your research? The answer is most unlikely. The second strategy that we can deploy is matching. Matching is actually a strategy that can be deployed when we have a control group with the restriction, I had only treatment groups. Matching, what we do, we actually match, as the name suggests, the same value of the confounder in the treatment groups plus the control non-treatment group. So it's very similar to restriction because exactly same rules may apply. And just like with the restriction that I've discussed, you have similar limitations, which are It again restricts your sample, just like with the restriction strategy. Your experiment may take longer to complete. You may not be exploring all the beauty of potential interactions that exist out there. And again, you cannot foresee all possible confounding variables. The third strategy that is used to minimize the effect of confounding variables is actually random allocation of participants to the group. Random allocation minimizes researchers' bias. So as a researcher, I'm not biased. I'm not allocating a particular group of people to a particular treatment, but it also allows us to randomize these confounding variables, which we are not accounting for, across the conditions in theory. The fourth strategy is to actually measure those confounding variables and extraneous variables during your experiments through the survey or questionnaire you're using. And then you would use them as part of your statistical analysis to model the effects of your independent variable and those confounding variables on the dependent variable. And statistically, you should be able to separate or to measure the effect of intervention versus confounding variables to tell a much better, well-rounded story and show those unique and interesting interactions. When, for example, stress is like this, then this or this strategy is effective. Or when this is present, none of them are useful. This is the beauty of research because it allows you to measure something in a more holistic way, and you may find some really interesting intricacies in your data. Of course, there could be a disadvantage that measuring confounding variables sometimes, not necessarily in this case, sometimes it can alert participants about the purpose of research, and then they may be providing you the answers that they expect you would like to have. Again, you cannot foresee every possible confounding variables in your research, even when you try to measure, but there are limitations in any research that we do. What's important is that we give a really good thought to potential confounding and extraneous variables, to those alternative explanations, and we try to measure them and account for them. My preferred method is actually random allocation of participants to the groups, plus measuring of those confounding and extraneous variables when I model them statistically. Now, just before I wrap up, one last note you that the moderating variable, and I do have a separate video for it, is not a confounding or extraneous variable. Moderating variable is a factor which is independent from the intervention that you are executing, but it impacts on the relationship between independent and dependent variable. It either strengthens it or it weakens it. That's why I have plus sign for strengthening this relationship or negative sign for weakening this relationship. And usually moderating variables, they form part of your hypothesis. So you're measuring this data. So naturally, it cannot be your extraneous variable, which you are not accounting for or you didn't foresee or you didn't measure it, because you're actually measuring it as part of your research, because it forms part of your hypothesis. That's what makes marketing research or research psychology and sociology quite interesting, because here you show that if this is the intervention, this is the effect, but if this is present, then, well, the effect is slightly, it becomes attenuated or it becomes boosted. Now, this is everything for extraneous and confounding variables and a bit of moderating variables. I hope now you feel confident to navigate experimental research landscape. You understand that there could be extraneous variables, external factors that may impact on the effects that you're measuring, but now you know about the strategies that can help you minimize their effects on the dependent variable.